Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Sarah Abrevaya Stein, the Sady and Ludwig Kahn director of the L&D Levy Center and a professor of history here and the holder of the Viterbi Chair in Mediterranean Jewish Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our event today celebrating Cathleen Shine's wonderful new book, Künstlers in Paradise. I'm going to offer a few words of introduction, but not about our guest, welcoming you to the event and also welcoming Kathleen's conversation partner, Mark Sarvas, who will in turn introduce Kathleen in a formal way because we're trying to create a little element of drama for you. But it is my pleasure to welcome you today to thank the Kahn Book Talk in German Jewish Studies, which has sponsored in German Jewish Studies series, which is sponsored this evening, to thank the Levy Center staff for all of their work, to ask you please to silence anything you have that might interrupt us in the course of the event, to tell you that alas, we're not successful in selling the book at today's event, but we invite you to turn to your independent local bookstore, to Macmillan Publishers to buy it, or if you must, online through Amazon. Again, I'm not going to be introducing the book or our main speaker, but instead I have the great pleasure of introducing Kathleen's conversation partner, Mark Sarvas, it's a delight to welcome back to UCLA. He doesn't really need welcome because he teaches for creative writing for UCLA. Mark Sarvas is the award-winning author of the novels Memento Park, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and Harry Revised, published by Bloomsbury. The first is the winner of the 2019 American Book Award, and the 2019 American Jewish Library Association Fiction Award, was a finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature and shortlisted for the Wingate Literary Prize and longlisted for the Sophie Brody Medal. His debut novel, Harry Revised, was published in more than a dozen countries around the world, earning much praise from international press, was a finalist for the Southern California Independent Booksellers Association's Fiction Award, the Denver Post Good Read list, and has been lauded as a remarkable debut by such luminaries as Booker Prize winner John Banville, and has been received much attention locally and internationally. He received a 2018 Santa Monica Arts Fellowship and a 2021 Guildhall Artist in Residence. You can read his writing in the New York Times Book Review, the Threepenny Review, Philadelphia Inquirer, and many, many other sources, including the Los Angeles Review of Books, for which he is a contributing editor. I could go on with my great praise, but instead of continuing to read all of the wonderful things he does and has written and the places that continue to cover his work, I want to say that he has been an incredibly devoted teacher of novel writing through the UCLA Extension Writers Program. I know we have a number of former and perhaps current students of his in the room. And it is wonderful that he has chosen to join our community and create this important bridge between our ongoing interest in German Jewish studies and Kathleen Shine's wonderful fictional approach to this topic broadly conceived. So we welcome you back from the Monterey Peninsula, Mark Sarvas, and we turn to you to introduce our guest and her new book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for as good an introduction as I have ever received. Thank you for that. Can you hear me all right in the back? I don't know if this is on or not, but I project, so I think we're all right. So I'm going to sort of do a little two-part introduction for Kathleen here today because I'm so thrilled to be here and thrilled to have been asked. Totally worth the drive down from Monterey. I have sort of a list of Kathleen's formal accomplishments, which we'll talk about, but then we'll have what I call some little unstructured quelling as I talk about how much I loved this novel and how excited I am to talk about it with all of you. So Cathleen Shine is the author of the internationally best-selling novels The Love Letter, which was made into a movie starring Kate Capshaw, and Rameau's Niece, which was made into a movie, The Misadventures of Margaret, starring Parker Posey. Shine's other novels, this is her 12th, Are Alice in Bed, To the Birdhouse, The Evolution of Jane, She Is Me, The New Yorkers, The Three Wisemans of Westport, Finn and Lady, They May Not Mean to, But They Do, and The Grammarians. In addition to the novels, she has written articles for The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, The New York Times Sunday Magazine, The New York Times Book Review. Her essays have been included in Best American Essays 2005, Fierce Pajamas, an anthology of New Yorker humor, and the Big New Yorker Book of Dogs. She grew up in Westport, Connecticut, and lives in Venice, California. We're here today to discuss her latest novel, Künstlers in Paradise, newly out in paperback, as I understand. So, and I do really agree with Sarah's encouragement. If you have not read this book yet, go out at once, order it, get it anywhere but Amazon. It's a treat. It was a People Magazine Book of the Week, an NPR Best Book of the Year. The Wall Street Journal said, quote, a moving and entertaining novel about how we revisit memories to make meaning for ourselves and others. Her buoyant dialogue has the zip of great comedy routines, which is true. The New York Times Book Review called it a paean to the regenerative power of storytelling and to Los Angeles itself. I adored the novel. Its subject matter, I think, is perfectly calibrated to place it in my strike zone, and we'll talk about that this afternoon. It made me homesick for the city I left during the pandemic that she documents. The novel contains multitudes. It is not a tome, and it is a brisk read, and yet the novel is a who's who of wartime émigré LA. It is a lockdown novel, a coming-of-age story, a mystery, a comedy, an intergenerational family saga, all rolled into one. It is filled with humor and heart and wisdom, and I loved every page. So please welcome the author that People Magazine has called a modern-day Jewish Jane Austen, and I love that. So welcome, Kathleen.
I don't know if I project, so I'm going to do this. First of all, I'm really honored to be here with all of you, and thank you, and really honored to be with you. That's that's a treat. We haven't seen each other for years and years, so this is really a wonderful gift. So thank you for that.
Thank you. For me too. So one of the things that first I'll just mention in passing is, so Kathleen has worked with one of the gold-plated rock star publicists in the publishing industry. And one of the reasons that this publicist is so good is that she knows the taste of reviewers and critics. And over the years, when Kimberly has said to me, you must read this book, like I will literally put aside what I'm doing and read the book because she knows my taste that well. And she said that about this novel when it came out.
Kimberly.
So we should probably begin with a little bit of a overview to the plot summary, such as it is, and I can do that, or if you're practiced at it and you would like to do it, either way. But for folks who haven't read the book yet, let's ground them.
I never know whether to start with the grandson or the grandmother. What do you think?
Interestingly, I start with the pandemic.
You do it. I'll be interested. Thank you.
As I've been thinking about this for a few days because I knew we'd have to discuss it in Künstlers in Paradise. The pandemic lockdown brings together a 93-year-old European émigré who has fled the war, and her 20-something, somewhat directionless, feckless grandson.
I wish you had written the jacket copy. It's very
succinct,
efficient. Yeah.
And he comes out for a sort of get his head on straight visit to Grandma in Venice from his Upper West Side rather painfully progressive parents, and he's come for a break, unsure of himself, and it is through the sharing of these stories, her history, that this wonderful bond is created, this remarkable trajectory unfolds, and we are immersed at once, I think, into a glorious lost age. And as I said, it'll be interesting to talk about the way people come to this book who maybe have a greater feel for the dramatis personae, and the people maybe who know less about it, and yet still can get swept into this world because, as I say, there's so much going on in the book. But it is a wonderful, funny, heartbreaking, wise book, and
Thank you.
I think that sort of puts us there. So, I'll also tell you that the single biggest direct impact on my life of having read your book is that we now have 5 o'clock cocktail hour. We have institutionalized it. So
Well, I'm sorry, we've moved it, we're at 4.
at 4, I know. For me, that was a bit early still because I'm dealing with the kid and homework and things
Yeah,
like that.
yeah,
But by
yeah.
5 o'clock, we were ready to kick in. And
That's
the importance of the cocktail hour and the elegance and the dignity of the cocktail hour is really brought home in this wonderful book. So
Our dog, we tried to change it after lockdown, and our dog will not let us. At 4 o'clock, she comes and she starts whining because she wants almonds. And she pushes and she won't stop until we have our cocktail hour. So 4 o'clock.
that's it. And is it the gin martinis for you or is it something else?
No, I don't drink gin. But no,
No.
my wife drinks gin martinis. No, I drink a little bit of. My children are very ashamed of me because I drink Jack Daniels, and they think it's really infra-dig that I should be drinking a really good bourbon. So they said, "Didn't you finish with that in college?" And I said, "No, in college we didn't drink. We took drugs. That's how old I am." So yeah.
So we like what we like.
Yes.
So, I think it's probably useful. Again, I've read a lot of your interviews in preparation for this, so I'm aware of some of this. But I think for you to maybe talk to the room about just the initial sparks for what brought this novel to life for you.
Can you hear me if I'm just talking? Good. Okay. So I was reviewing a biography of Alma Mahler, Gustav Mahler, the composer's infamous wife. Perhaps you've heard the Tom Lehrer song about her. She did either marry or sleep with all of 19th and early 20th century modernism, basically. And she was considered the most beautiful girl in Vienna. Anyway, I was reading this biography of her, and I came across this time when she moved to Los Angeles with her husband, Franz Werfel, who was at the time a very respected novelist. He wrote The Song of Bernadette, but he also wrote a lot of stuff before that. And being a New Yorker for 40 years or so, I did not have a very high opinion of Los Angeles, the culture. I just didn't think there was any here. I mean, I moved here and it seemed like, well, I was wrong, except it was all too far away because we live in Venice, so it's so far to get to Disney Hall. But I thought, okay, but there didn't used to be. It's just a place with beaches. And then I was reading this, and it's like Alma Mahler lived in Pacific Palisades with her husband. Thomas Mann lived in Pacific Palisades. Salka Fertel, who was a screenwriter and whose book I think everyone who lives in California should read. It's called The Kindness of Strangers. It's a memoir, and it inspired / I used a lot of the stuff from that book in my book. It's a beautiful book about Vienna and then coming to LA. And Arnold Schoenberg and Stravinsky was here and Bertolt Brecht was here, and it was like, wait a minute, all these people were here at the same time. And I realized that there was this colony of émigrés who had left or had escaped Vienna and Germany and France, and had climbed over the Pyrenees and gotten on the last boat out, and all helped by Hollywood, which had started the European Film Fund, which helped get some visas for some people, but other people just escaped. And I thought, my God, the high culture at this period was centered in Los Angeles, California, and that fascinated me. And I thought, I have to write about these people. They were all émigrés. What did they feel like? What was it like, having been so important in Europe, and then suddenly you're in sunny California, and life is very, very different. And 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 they felt that, and they felt also tremendous guilt for being here while their families and their world was being destroyed in Europe. And I started writing. I had a vague idea about Mamie, the main character, the grandmother in the book. It just wasn't really working, and then the pandemic came. And that was it. And I thought, well, I'm not writing one of my little novels. The world is coming to an end. Everything is horrible. People are dying all over. And I would sit in our little garden, and, it was so beautiful. It was so quiet. No helicopters. LA was completely shut down, if you remember. It seems like so long ago, it almost seems like a dream. And I was sitting there, and the jasmine was out, and everything smelled so good, and it was so beautiful. And then I'd call my mother, and in the background, sirens. Siren after siren after siren, because it was New York City in the beginning of the pandemic. And, people were in refrigerator trucks. I mean, it was horrible. And I'd call my brother, sirens, all sirens. And I'd call friends, and all I heard was sirens, and everyone was locked in their little apartments. And I felt this tremendous guilt. And when that happened, I thought, oh, I'm having a similar kind of guilt to these émigrés, and maybe that's a way in, it was like a bridge. And I thought, oh, I can do this, and maybe I should do this. And that's when I really started writing, and realized that a grandson would come and visit Mamie, this character who I had already started writing about. And then the book kind of happened. As they do.
Yes, as they do, or don't sometimes. But I wonder, I don't know what the experience for others will be, but having now a 90-year-old mother who was from Central Europe but raised in Vienna, at a certain point I kept seeing my mother in Mamie. I saw so many of her habits and her ideas and her perspective on the world, and I started to feel like her Julian a little bit in places. So there's so much in there that I want. You have this refrain that you return to throughout the novel from Isherwood. I'm bitterly ashamed that I'm here in safety, and this is spoken by a few characters. And I know there was a sense of that in the pandemic. And we were living in an apartment in Santa Monica, but we could go outside, year round if we needed to sit outside and have a meal. And we were aware of the guilt and the privilege and all of that. And I think that things can be parallel or similar without being the same. And I think that's an important distinction here, right? I think there are...
Yeah, I mean, I was not comparing the pandemic to the Holocaust.
I don't think you were.
And I think I made that as clear as I could in the book, because I think that would be sort of obscene. But yes, there are parallels and there are bridges, and it gave me a way to investigate these émigrés. And so this was not about the people left behind. It was about the people who left them behind and how they felt and how they coped with it. So for me, it was really a bridge into Mamie and how she might feel, and all of these other really very distinguished and famous people who congregated in LA.
So in your acknowledgments and in your interviews, you've talked a little bit about like the rabbit hole of your research and the way. I have a dear friend who runs this secular think tank in the Netherlands, the Nexus Institute. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Yeah.
And Rob Riemann runs this, and he is a Thomas Mann devotee. And when he came to visit me in LA, he said, "Mark, we will go to the house in the Palisades," which I'd never been to. I knew I knew a little bit about Weimar on the Pacific from the 97 Artist in Exile exhibition at LACMA. I think some of us who were here then may have seen that. But he took me there, and then he took me to, I guess, a far less distinguished address that Mann had for a little while on Montana Avenue, near Montana and Princeton. And there was all of this sort of Villa Aurora. There was I had a similar dawning about what this place had been, but I don't think I leapt into the research quite as fully as you did. And you talked about, I think you read many, many memoirs and things like that. And I'd love to hear a little bit about where your paths took you.
Well, when I first started this before, and it was pre-COVID, I thought, I've lived here for so long, and I still barely know, where I live a mile from the ocean, so I know where that is. Mm-hmm. But I still did not really know LA, and I thought, well, this will give me an opportunity. And I'm just on the verge of being agoraphobic, and I thought, well, this will get me out, and I'll go to all these places, and I'll see them, and maybe I'll interview people, and I'll go to the LA library downtown, and I can do this. I have GPS, and then the lockdown came, and I said, oh, thank God. I don't have to go anywhere. I just have to do what I love to do, which is do research and read and go on the internet and dig and dig and dig. And that's what I did. And I read a lot of memoirs. Some of them were from an earlier period. Vicky Baum, who wrote Grand Hotel, which the movie, the Garbo and Other People movie was based on, came here much earlier. And she was incredibly famous, like bizarrely famous, since she was a screenwriter. But she, people recognized her in the grocery stores. I guess there were society pages in those days. Anyway, her autobiography, her memoir about Vienna was just so wonderful and so helpful to me, even though it was about a slightly earlier period. So there were just a lot of people that I discovered just by, and then reading one book, and then they mention someone, and then you go and you read that book, and it was a lot of fun, sort of, but reading memoirs of a lot of people from around 1933 in 2020 and 21 and 22 in the United States is terrifying, because politically and what was happening was so similar and so scary. So I have been a nervous wreck for a long time, looking, trying to figure out. Which room can we turn into a secret closet? Which country are we going to go to? Because I read all this stuff and it was in my head, and then I'd read the newspaper and it would be something very similar. So anyway, that's the downside, but the upside was it was fascinating and really helped me with the characters.
You sort of tempted me to go down my own path of reading some of that source material, because I think I didn't want the world of the book to be over. So,
Nice.
I want to sort of continue in that.
And just let me say one thing.
Yeah.
When I finished the book, I was really upset because I thought it's not good enough. I have let these people down. And I had a really difficult time when it was finished. And my editor loved it, and everybody, it's wonderful, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, yes, but I've let them down. These are important people. They had these incredible lives. They wrote about them so beautifully, and I've let them down. It took me a while to shake that. I felt a great responsibility to the people I was basically stealing passages from, or, descriptions of the grandfather and that kind of thing. But then, no book is ever as good as you really want it to be, so I covered.
And I don't think you let them down at all. I
Well,
think they are so wonderfully, vividly alive in this book, both the very famous people and the members of the family, wherever you
Thank
drew
you.
that from. I don't think I'll ever forget Schoenberg running through the Brentwood Country Mart shouting that he is not syphilitic.
Yes, I am not. That's true.
Yeah.
That really happened. Arnold Schoenberg had a feud with Thomas Mann, who was his friend. But Thomas Mann was writing, he wrote Dr. Faustus. And Dr. Faustus is about a composer who develops a musical theory, basically 12-tone music, exactly like Schoenberg's discovery, if you want to call it that. And Mann got Adorno, who was also a friend of Schoenberg's, to help him get all the music right. And so when the book came out, Alma Mahler, who was a bit of a troublemaker, among other things, called Schoenberg. You know, it was this very small, tight community, called Schoenberg and said, you know, there's the character in the book, he sells his soul to the devil and then he gets syphilis. So Schoenberg went berserk and said, you know, and then actually read the book. He had put it, you know, Mann gave him a copy and he put it in his bookcase. Then he read it. And here was this composer who became insane, but it was all because of this horrible discovery of this 12-tone inhuman system that was kind of, I don't know, sort of the same as all the bad things about Germany, and then he got syphilis. So they had a feud, and there were and he said, this is my intellectual property, and they were both ridiculous about it, but they had a feud, which they eventually made up. But there was this incident where he saw, Schoenberg was at the Brentwood Country Mart, and he saw Martha Furtwanger. I can't pronounce that name, but Martha Furtwanger, I think is right, and ran through screaming in German, I do not have syphilis. I do not have syphilis. So that's yes.
So, and that really happened, and yet I think you deploy Schoenberg so beautifully in this novel because he becomes very important to Mamie, and 12-tone becomes important. There's this wonderful, and I was with Mamie 100%, by the way, with her sort of, Mamie is, as a child, is very put off by scales, piano scales, and feels that there's a note between C and C sharp that the keyboard does not concede, and this is just like a stumbling block. She sort of can't get past that. And I think the 12-tone opens the door to think about scales differently, and then of course he points her to the violin. It becomes very important in her life. So you wonderfully integrate these real characters and make them so impactful in her journey. I loved all of that reckoning with the scale and the I thought of the Gershwin's opening clarinet note, Rhapsody in Blue, the way it sort of climbs through. That's not a question, but what does that where does that send you?
I played the violin I took violin lessons, I should say, for about 9 years without really understanding what a scale was, and it always upset me, and it's like, what is it? It's so arbitrary, I don't get it. And I didn't even realize how little I got it. But when I started reading about Schoenberg, I thought, well, you cannot read about 12-tone music until you understand what a scale is. So I did. That took about 6-8 months of just going online, listening to things played, listening to all different kinds of scales, printing out a keyboard so I could, go like that to try to understand it. It was great. It took a really, really long time to kind of take in that, yes, I was right, scales are arbitrary, but they're also not, because they're about the way notes reverberate. So that was actually a lot of fun, and then I got to give that to Mamie, and her father is a pianist and is going crazy because he can't teach her the piano because she's so angry about the scales and feels they're oppressive and that it's like Hitler, and he gives
Which is amazing. That moment is this dramatic rupture, my breath went short in that moment. It was really magnificent. So,
thank you. He just about gives her a smack, but it's like devastating to him that she would say such a thing. But eventually she gets introduced to Schoenberg, and of course what they really like to do is play tennis. He teaches her to play tennis because he was a big tennis player. And that's how I I originally meant to write about many more characters from that period than I did. But somehow I got completely hooked on Arnold Schoenberg and Greta Garbo. A very odd coupling. But you fall in love, and I was doing some research, and I saw a picture of Schoenberg, and he had his tennis whites on, and his bald head, his big ears, his big Jewish nose, and these intense eyes, and I thought, God, he looks like this is Schoenberg, the one who's so scary that I'm afraid to listen to his music because it's so terrifyingly difficult. This is Arnold Schoenberg, and I thought he could be a Jewish uncle, and a Jewish uncle I want to have. And so I just started reading about him, and first there was the Thomas Mann feud, which I thought was fascinating, and I thought, okay, well then I have to definitely have him in. But then I started reading about him, his life and his children and his family life in LA and all the dogs he had. I know the names of all his dogs.
And he taught here, right?
And he taught here, and he was underpaid, underappreciated, taught undergraduates, many of whom had no interest, were just taking it as a kind of gut course, and he loved teaching. And but it was very tiring for him because he took it so seriously. But there was no music department at UCLA when he was teaching here. It was part of the education department, and they would roll in a piano like that into the room, and then Arnold Schoenberg would be teaching these kids about composition, and he made them learn all the classical composition before they were allowed to move on to what he did. And I think John Cage was one of his pupils and couldn't stand it. It was like
I bet.
but he was this funny teacher, and there's a great memoir by someone named Dika Newland, who was a prodigy and came when she was a very young teenager with her mother to study with him. And she wrote a memoir. She called him Uncle Arnold. And she wrote a memoir about him, and he just was this funny, crazy, at one point he started galloping across the room, going, "Hi-oh, Silver," because he was making fun of one of the rhythm of one of the compositions that they did. He was like this funny, playful guy. And Dika Newland became a Schoenberg scholar, but she also, in later years, in her 70s, she became a punk rocker whose signature song was to stand on the stage and scream, "Meow." So I feel there's some Schoenberg playfulness living in Dika Newland. But that's also a wonderful book to read. And that gave me a real perspective on him. And when I spoke at the Thomas Mann House, which was basically the high point of my life. I mean, this is wonderful, and thank you all, but it was a Thomas Mann House in his living room.
Wow.
And the Schoenberg boys were there. I just can't help but I think of them as the boys. But the boys are in their, 70s and 80s, and they were there. And afterward, and I was so nervous about writing about Schoenberg and somehow getting it wrong, but this is what I felt he would do. And it's very hard to put words, for me, to put words into the mouth of a famous person. It's, what are you, how dare you? It just seems so presumptuous. But it was like, and then so the greatest and highest honor of my life got even higher because they said, "Oh, you got him. You got his playfulness," and then he'd get very fierce and blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, I got, and after that I thought, well, okay, I don't have to write anymore. I'm done. This is it.
You've arrived. You've arrived.
Yep.
That's it. There are two sort of interesting structural things that I think happen in the book. One is the pandemic itself, right? And I wonder, I've read now 3 pandemic novels in a row just by happenstance. I don't know if you've read any of the others. I read Marie Mockett's new novel, The Tree Doctor. I read Sigrid Nunez's The Vulnerables, and I've read this. And I wonder if what I see in all of those books is, and I know this sounds counterintuitive for those of us who lived a lockdown experience, but something for the writer a little liberating about the pandemic, that it allows for the sort of amplitude that can just move beyond the four walls that you're in. So, but it also provides this. One of the things we always struggle with when we're writing is how do we maintain tension? Where does the tension come from? And well, when the tension is you can die at any minute, that's kind of good enough, and it's the same as just the tension of war. Yeah. And this book has that tension runs through it.
So it was a gift, is what you're saying.
A weird kind of a gift, and probably not that I wouldn't give it back. I wouldn't return that gift if I could.
Right.
So that's part of this narrative construction. Then you've got Julian, and for me, I loved the anecdotes. I loved the stories. I so connect and relate to these things, but it was the moment. There's a moment around the middle of the book, what Julian is the 20-something grandson, and he's met a girl in the neighborhood during the pandemic. They're walking dogs together, and they had this sort of masked courtship. And he begins telling her Mamie stories.
Yeah.
And then I thought, I get what she's doing. I see what you're doing. And I felt this power of this transfer of family experience and the way it sort of begins to fill Julian up, the way it begins to work on him, change him. His is the character that has an arc, if you will, right? I mean, Mamie's 93, turns 94. She is set. But he goes through this change. And it's this wonderful dance that you pull off. And I was wondering if you might talk about, Julian was not part of your research. He wasn't necessarily, so how did he enter the story? How did you figure out what to do with him?
Well, I have two sons, first of all, and they're adults. One's 36 and one's 41, but still calling me to say, Mom, which mold remediation company should I use? And I don't mean just calling me, I mean like texting 10 times a day, but there's mold. But anyway, so I watched my sons with my mother. And there was from the time they were very small children, there was such an incredible bond between them that had nothing to do with me, and it was such a beautiful thing to watch for both of them. It really meant a lot. But then also as a writer, when you're writing about someone and their mother or their father, there is no way to write about, Lillian and Joseph, the father, without it being about the father and the child, right? I mean, even as you're writing about them, there's that's it. That's what their connection is. But when you're writing about a grandchild and a grandmother, it's very different. That all that baggage, that strong, that membrane is not there. So that for me, it made it easier for Mamie to look at Julian and see him. And it made Julian be able to see Mamie, whereas Julian couldn't really see his parents. They were his parents. And his parents couldn't really see Julian because that was their son who was getting more and more annoying. And so as a writer, I found I found very liberating to have, because that's a lot of times how I discover who characters are, by having another character look at them and react to them, and then have the back and forth. So I thought, and there's a joke that grandchildren and grandparents have a common enemy, the parents. Mm-hmm. But for me, it was just it really allowed me to see the characters much better. When I was doing the first reading that I did for this, both my kids were there, and my younger son raised his hand the question time, and he said, so with Julian, did you have any, real life, models for him? And I didn't in a lot of ways, but I did use some of their passions, with certain kinds of Japanese. One of my sons tried to learn Japanese. Little details, but anyway, that was very funny, and the room laughed, And he laughed, and I laughed, and I never answered the question. So there you go.
Well, and he does, in some ways, like he seems to encompass a lot about contemporary 20-something directionlessness, right?
Yeah.
Because that's just it, and that's okay for that age. But what I really love is that Mamie has this kind of unagended, if you will, honesty with him, where she just says it. She just, and I think he does hear it from her in a way that he can't hear it from his parents.
And I think she also has faith in him.
Yes.
Which as parents you do and you don't. I mean, you do, but the anxiety is so powerful that sometimes you question that, and kids feel that. But she has some kind of underlying faith in him being a real human being and not just this 20-something.
And he does things along the way that she registers as a spark. Yeah. There are moments where okay, point for Julian, that's promising. And by the end, he knows how to make a decent martini. So he clearly, he learns. I have a few more things I really want to make sure I ask before we end, because I'm dying to talk about. But I'm mindful of time, and I want to give anyone in the room who may have a question for Kathleen the opportunity to speak up, ask your questions, and if there's anything you'd like to know about.
2 questions. Were you able to do all your research online? And the second thing is, did you get into the émigrés that were in the film business?
The question was I able to do all of my research online, and did I get into any of the émigrés who were in the film business? The émigrés in the film business are on the periphery in this book. I mean, they turn up. And Greta Garbo, I mean, she wasn't Jewish, but she was an émigré, and she was certainly in the film business. She is a major character in the book. I did, in a way, I did all the research online in that I would find a book that I needed, and then I could find a used bookseller who had that book. Or I could, so I used a lot of real books, real paper books, but I found them because I found something in my research. But did I go anywhere and ask anybody anything? No. I used to be a reporter, and I really hated it. And the thing I hated was having to talk to people. And when I would hear a tape of an interview or something, usually it was me talking, and not even, I was so bad at it. So no, I didn't even get to see the Thomas Mann house because of the lockdown. And so no, I did everything online. But when what you're dealing with is other people's writing, their memoirs, that works. So that was, that made it possible, really.
Sarah.
A thought and a question. The thought is, when I read this unfolding of relationship between grandmother and grandchild, to me it seemed an embodiment of what intergenerational memory, and also intergenerational trauma, how it's lived. So you can comment on that or not, but I thought that was this way of how one generation's stories become the story of the third generation, in their own embodiment, in different form. I thought that was really interesting.
Oh, that's interesting. And yes, but it was also, Mamie never tells her stories to her son, and he never asks. He doesn't want to know, and she doesn't really want to tell him, because some of them are rather racy, and she has spent her life trying not to think about them. So having Julian, but realizing that this is her legacy, I think, and having Julian there to receive it, makes her open up and confront what she went through and lived through.
That was one of the questions that I was going to ask. I'm glad you did. No, I'm good to hear it from the...
The question was, you opened by saying that you had thought that LA had no culture, and then you wrote this book and you discovered otherwise, but it also strikes me that one could have the mistaken impression that LA has no Jewish history. And perhaps,
Oh, I never thought that.
But your book is so full full of a Jewish emigre story.
Because of the movie business and because I have read a lot of, I knew there were a lot of emigres here because I knew about movies and I knew about all these, directors, but I didn't know it was a real colony of German-speaking emigres. So I don't know anything about the community of people who came from other places. I really only know about this group. But I did know there were Jews here, also because it's like New York, you move here and here we are. It's just something, I don't know, I did know that. And of course all the people I know here practically are Jewish, because they just are. But yeah, I don't know anything about like regular people who came here at all.
Yes, Aliette.
I have not read the book yet, but there was a real-life prototype to Mamie. I forgot her name.
Salka Viertel? Yeah, absolutely. Originally, I very much wanted to base it on Salka. But, my character grew away from Salka in a lot of different ways. But in certain ways, yes, I absolutely used her. But she had such an incredible life. When she got here, she had a salon where all of these emigres would come. And it was very, very important in the life of LA.
The second question was, did you write anything about Erich Maria Remarque and his relationship with Marlene Dietrich?
I'm sorry, I can't.
Did you write about Erich Maria Remarque and his relationship with Marlene Dietrich?
I did not. I'm a Garbo girl. So.
That's the sequel. The sequel.
Yeah, right. No, I didn't. That's not in there.
Vicky.
I haven't yet read the book. It's highly recommended. I'm interested in the narrative strategy of the grandmother telling the stories to the son and to the grandson, and whether there's an overarching authorial voice in it as well. How you dealt with having the grandmother doing the narration and also the scenes.
Yeah.
So, and before you jump into that, because I wanted to say, I really wanted to commend this book to my students for study, because what you do that I really admire, there is a seamlessness between perspective and voice and memory. In one moment we're in one place in one head, and suddenly here, and yet it never feels like head hopping. It's really beautifully orchestrated, the balance between reported dialogue and then interiority. It's just, and I don't know how consciously you work on that or if it's just instinctive, but it's gorgeous and seamless, and so I would love for you to share that with my students.
Really, really nice to hear. The structure of this book came about because I had this interest in this colony of people, and I didn't want to write a historical novel. I just didn't. And I thought somehow, because they were famous and everything, it would just turn into something a little bit cheesy that I didn't want to do. And I'm not a big fan of historical novels, although I seem to be writing one now. But anyway, so all of this was like, how do I not make it a historical novel? What can I do? Who can tell what? And then I thought, okay, so now it's the pandemic, so it could be like Boccaccio, it could be like the Decameron, and and they each tell stories. But eventually, I realized, I follow my characters, and that's how the narrative happens, and that's how whatever structure there is happens. And my books are not always, the plots are not always galloping like Schoenberg across the room. But I really felt that there were two stories here, two time periods, and that Mamie was the one telling the stories. There's no narrator saying, I love having a narrator, because I love Trollope, and I love the narrator to just sort of suddenly appear out of the blue for no good reason except, the author wants to. But there's none of that, and I just felt this was a passing on of a legacy, and that the final, I won't tell you the very end, but the final quote is, I think that's what it's about, although it's, I hope, also funny.
Very.
Good.
Very.
But it's really, about these stories. Grandparent stories, in any case, really need to be told, should be told. But these particular stories, I felt very strongly, should be told. And so Mamie was my voice for telling them. And Julian was my ears for listening. And that's basically
But he does become ears with a mouth.
Well,
because
then he starts
to tell
telling
her
the stories
as well.
And yeah, exactly.
It actually, it's funny, it put me in mind a little of the ending of Arcadia, the Tom Stoppard play. And I don't know how well all of you know it, but Arcadia is a play that has a present-day story and then a past-tense story. And in the present day, people are trying to figure out what occurred in the past and getting it wrong, as academics will do. And then, no offense, and then in the closing sequence, past and present are in a single scene. And we see this seamlessness as they come together. And I felt the coming together of these worlds and these times here in the book. So it's just really wonderful.
Oh, that's good. I wanted that to happen because I think that it's true. Whether we're aware of our history or not, we're carrying it, a lot of it, with us. And, so I wanted that to be there.
Thank you.
So I must take a moment to talk about Agatha. And if this was a less august setting, I would be dropping an F-bomb there, because it's that level of enthusiasm that I have for this character, who is sort of introduced as Mamie's dog's body, and they've lived together for many decades now, and she takes care of her, Your Highness, and it's this wonderful, somewhat enigmatic relationship, and she's this glorious character, I think, wonderful comic character. Obviously, every time she enters, I was laughing, but there is a strain of tragedy, I think, in her story. And what struck me at the end, what I finally arrived at with her, is that because she's always got her handbag with her throughout, and we never quite know until the end what is in the handbag, and I will not necessarily spoil anything, but I felt like she embodies a little bit the present day iteration of the fear of the knock at the door. And you talk about that, the knock that may come, and the minute you hear the knock, somehow atavistically you know it's a bad knock. And I feel like she is, she's a remainder of that in the now, that thing doesn't go away, these things don't stop happening. But can you speak about where Agatha comes from, because she's just
she's my
delightful.
favorite, my absolute total favorite character.
You can feel it, yes, you feel the love for her.
Yeah. And when I first had her there, it really was just for comic, just a comic moment, and just an excuse for me to throw in a joke. And so she was a fairly superficial character, which, first draft doesn't bother me. I don't even notice. But then my wife, who's an incredible editor, would say things, said, Agatha, we want more, and we want to know about her. And I said, why? And then she said, well, Kathy, what's in the pocketbook? And I said, I don't know. Why would I know? And then I realized, okay, you can't do this. It's not fair to Agatha. No. And the more I wrote about her, I think the funnier she got, because I started to understand her a little bit better. But right before writing this, my mother was in her 90s. She was a very, very funny person, but she had a little bit of dementia toward the end, and she was in New York, home. I've lived here like 15 years. She was home in New York. And this woman, I guess, before the pandemic, there had been this caregiver who had actually been a housekeeper for us, and then started taking care of my mother. And she was a wonderful person, and she was from Brazil, and no one could understand anything she said, ever. And she was deaf. So she did not understand anything you said to her, but she was so great and wonderful that she kept working for everybody. And so, she'd go to the grocery store and come back with something completely different from whatever it was you had wanted. So physically and the nervous energy, and Agatha was like her, but her actual character and her relationship with Mamie, I just found it to be so great, and it brought out a lot of funny stuff for Mamie, and it brought out a lot of funny stuff for Agatha, and I just really liked her. And so people have asked me if she was actually, they were sure that she was really Mamie's lover, and I was like, no, I mean, that's good if you want to think that. I'm happy,
I wondered
don't
if you were
mind.
pointing that way at first, and then I was actually glad that it went a different way.
The closeness of them, at a certain point I realized, someone might really think that's what's going on, but there can be this, and I wanted it to be, this incredible closeness, this people who live together, even if one is working for the other or is the caregiver, they get a kind of rhythm, and they tease each other, and they insult each other, and they help each other, and that's what I really wanted to get at. And it is like a marriage, except it's not a marriage, and that wasn't, I tried very hard to put in enough stuff so that would be clear, but I also figured, listen, readers are the boss.
And they're also, well, what's touching for me is that, and they're also protective of
Yes,
each other.
yeah, very.
And that's the thing, yes, you're an employee, but it's more than that. And this is a book where everything is sort of more than that, and more than it appears. How are we on time? I know we're a little bit more. So this, one of the things I loved about your novel is that it immediately made me homesick for LA, like deeply homesick. I left LA in September 2020, pandemic flight up to the Monterey Peninsula, and although that sounds great and hunky-dory, I miss so much about LA, and I was immediately placed in your Venice, your Santa Monica. I love the tropes about how bad sea air is for you, that they're so worried in the beginning about
that's really in
the fear of sea air.
Yeah, in Salka Vertel's
The
memoir, she was told, you can't live in Santa Monica. The sea air is terrible for you. And she said, but look, all the movie stars have houses on the beach. And she was told, they have air conditioning. So, but she moved there anyway because she was no dope.
But it is this wonderful kind of love story to LA.
Yeah,
and you do something I really like in the language where there's just a little moment where they talk about that New York was, for the virus, had been a hot spot, and now LA is the hot spot. And Mamie comments how hot spot meant a very different thing in her day. That these cliches sort of change their meaning in time. And I think there is as you may have experienced, that sort of East Coast centered cliched view of LA. Every time I read the New York Times on anything about LA, I want to just kill myself because it's ridiculous.
Yes.
But you seem to have
Also, the New York Times on New York.
Yes.
It's getting worse and
getting worse. But you seem to have found this love and affection for the thousand little daily specifics of LA life that I also think you might miss that because you're focused on the specifics of the émigrés and their life, but it's wonderfully specific about LA and Venice. Santa Monica, Venice, the history of Venice. Can you talk about some of those pieces of your writing?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I did during the pandemic was walk the dog. We got a puppy right before the pandemic, so we have a pandemic puppy, which they're very particular. They're different from other dogs. They're used to you being around 24 hours a day, which luckily we both are anyway. So, but the only thing I did was walk the dog, and I made so many friends because everyone was home and everyone was sitting in their front yards, or they were walking with a mask, and you'd cross the street, so you'd be on different sides of the street, but you'd say hello, And there was, and I also, I mean, it's what I did. I walked around. And so this one, you know, in New York, people would joke that your neighborhood is 4 square blocks, and that's it. And you never leave those 4 square blocks unless you have to go to work. And that's, I think, very true. And for me, in LA, it's also true. I very rarely leave Venice and my little part of it, and we live on a walk street, so, you know, why would I? But walking around and noticing things, having time to notice, and the quiet also, and without anyone else around except occasionally this other dog walker. I mean, the only day there were a lot of people out was, remember there was a 1 o'clock curfew on one day? Every dog walker was out at noon, like saying, come on, come on. And so that's when, you know, you saw a lot of people. But otherwise it was pretty empty and quiet and beautiful, and gave me a chance to really look at things. And there was also one story that I had always been wanting to write about since I heard about it, about a man named Irving Tabor, who, when Abbot Kinney built Venice of America and built all the canals, and there was a pool now where Windward Circle is, and, you know, it was a pleasure area for people to come and ride, to go on rides and hear suffragettes give lectures and things like that. He wanted it to be both serious and fun. When he was building it, he was walking by and saw this man, Irving Tabor, and kind of liked the way he was working, and said, and Irving Tabor was black and was from near New Orleans, as were many, many of the black people who came to Venice. And he said, can you drive a car? After talking to him for a while, and Irving Tabor said, oh yes. And he said, okay, then I would like you to be my chauffeur. And luckily the car hadn't arrived and wasn't going to arrive for another 2 weeks, because Irving Tabor had no idea how to drive a car. So he quickly learned from a friend, and he became very close to Abbot Kinney, and they went all over together, and he became a kind of advisor. And when they would get to a hotel that wouldn't allow Irving Tabor in, Abbot Kinney, they would sleep in the car. Abbot Kinney wouldn't go there either, so they were very close friends. When Abbot Kinney died, he left his house to Irving Tabor. The only problem was Irving Tabor wasn't allowed to live in Venice, in that neighborhood, because of segregation. So he got a couple of his cousins and brothers, and they went to the house. They cut it in 3 pieces. They put it on barges pulled by mules, pulled it through the canals, and eventually got it on the streets, and there were other wagons, and pulled it to Oakwood, which is where black people lived, and put it back together. And it's still there. And I think some of his descendants still live in it. And I love that house. And when I get really depressed, I just walk past it and look at it and think, you know, this is a fairy tale. And I also thought, this house is also a kind of émigré. And someone wrote to me and said, there should be a children's book called The House That Found a Home, which is a line in the book. But my agent did not, it's not very encouraging.
Did not go for it.
No, she's not. So anyway, so that was also very interesting to walk by that house and think about that, and finally find a worthy place for it, for the story.
Yeah, that's a wonderful tale.
Yeah.
When Sarah was talking about parents, it sort of harkened me back to something that Marissa Silver, the novelist, who's a mutual friend, and I talked about when my second book, Memento Park, came out, because it's a post-Holocaust intergenerational family story. And one of the questions that we were talking about is, we were talking about the incuriosity of kids about their parents' intimate lives and struggles, but also, and it's a question I think that sort of dances around the perimeter here, is what are parents entitled to keep to themselves? Like, what are the pieces of their lives that they don't share with their kids, that just like you don't get to know? And you want to, I feel like there's a little bit of that dancing around in here as well.
Yeah, I mean, even with Mamie, there are things she wants Julian to know and to carry with him, and there are other things that are hers, and she doesn't have to share. They're just hers. And I think that's also an important part of secrets. Some secrets are secret, and you keep them that way.
And I love, I mean, the way you struck, that comes at the end, that it comes, again, no spoilers, so whatever the secret is, you get to read and find out, but that there's been this journey of sharing and discovery and knowledge, and yet, like, this is the door that stays closed.
And it took me a while to get there. I mean, I had a whole other version of this where she, believe it or not, she dies and leaves a letter and blah, and that's how he finds out. You know, that's when I was trying to find a structure,
Right.
and it was all wrong. And I am in a correspondence with this wonderful writer, Cynthia Ozick, and she read the book, and I said to her, you know, at a certain point I had Mamie die, and she wrote back, and she's very forceful.
Yes.
And she said, how could you even think of doing that to that wonderful woman? And she was right. It was all
No, I seized
wrong.
a little just now when you
Yeah,
said
right?
it. Like, I
It's just
wouldn't want to read
ugly,
that version of
wrong,
this.
easy,
Yeah.
you know, so, yeah,
Well,
no. Mamie
again,
lives on.
I thank you. I mean, I just thank you. This
Well,
book
thank
is a
you.
gift. It really was a gift.
You're
Oh, I'm
an
sorry.
awfully
One more
good
question.
reader. Yeah.
Let's jump in. Yes, please do.
I did read the book.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you because I feel like it's so much richer now. And thank goodness the whole book I kept saying, oh, she's going to die. And I fell in love with her, and I agree that I would have been very upset.
It would have been wrong.
It would have been wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a beautifully written book.
Thank you, and thank you for, yeah, it would have been wrong. I feel guilty even that I even thought of it.
Well, and I got to say, like, I never worried about that. Like, to me, you had written, I felt like the world of this book had been established in such a way that I really was not worried. Like, it didn't enter my mind, although I thought, yes, she's old, and I guess it's a chronological possibility. But I thought, this isn't a book that's going to kill this wonderful person off. So I'm glad.
Yeah, no, I saved her, thank God. I mean, she saved herself. It would have just been, it was all wrong. It was,
If you haven't read it yet, please do order it. Out in paperback now. I don't know if anybody brought copies. They may want you to sign it if that's a thing. But here today. But if not,
thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. It's really nice.
thank you, everybody. Thank you for being part of it.